Hi everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. I recently changed out the bearings on my table saw, and in doing so I had to remove the tabletop. Now with the tabletop placed back onto the cabinet, I need to set the blade parallel to the miter slots and the fence. Now there are numerous ways to do this, and this method I'm going to show you today primarily uses a combination square. So let's get started. To get started, I mark one of the teeth on the blade with a Sharpie. This tooth will be my reference tooth as I check the alignment from the front to the back of the blade. With the body of the combination square pressed against the side of the miter slot, I extend the blade so the tooth is right next to one of the graduation lines. Once I have the square aligned with the tooth, I lock the blade down and move the tooth and the square to the back of the saw, and check to see where on the ruler the tooth ends up. In this case, the tooth is about 1/32 of an inch further from the miter slot. With this information, I now know the table needs to move clockwise. I'll snug up the bolt in the front left corner and leave the other three loose, giving me a pivot point. To start making adjustments, I use a rubber mallet to tap the back left corner to bring the miter slot closer to the blade. As I'm adjusting with the mallet, I'll periodically check the front of the blade to make sure the measurement isn't changing. So just continue to make adjustments with your mallet until the sawtooth is at exactly the same place on the scale from front to back. Now this method is really simple and it's probably precise enough for this application, but what if you can't see the lines on your ruler or you want to be a little more precise? Well, in that case, you can bring in what's called a set of feeler gauges. And these are really simple if you're not familiar with them. All they are is just a collection of different thickness pieces of metal. Mine here goes from 1.5 thousandths up to 35 thousandths of an inch. And you can use this in combination with your combination square to actually dial in your settings even closer. So let me show you how to do that. Start by adjusting your combination square so the edge of the blade is contacting the tooth on the saw blade. Moving the square to the back of the blade, we can see the table still needs to move further to the right because there's a noticeable gap between the ruler and the sawtooth. Now here's the cool part. We can use the feeler gauge to determine exactly how far the table needs to move. I'll work through the feelers until I find one that just barely fits through the gap. In this case, the gap is 21 thousandths of an inch. I'll use the mallet to continue tapping the table to close the gap. After a few taps, I'll stop to check the size of the gap. Now it's 10 thousandths of an inch. Once again, a few more taps, and now the gap is 2 thousandths of an inch, which is really close enough for me. With the blade aligned, I can move on to aligning the fence. I do exactly the same thing with the square and the feelers. I set the square so that it is just touching the fence at the front and move the square to the back and look for a gap. In this case, the gap is 13 thousandths of an inch. Since there is a gap at the back, the fence needs to be adjusted towards the blade. This is easily done by screwing in the set screw on the right side of the fence. After making the adjustment, I'll check for a gap again. Looks like the gap is gone. Or is it? I can tell that I adjusted the fence too far because there's now a gap between the body of the square and the edge of the miter slot. I can also use the feelers at this point to determine how far I overshot the adjustment by. 3 thousandths too far. I'll back the screw out a little bit and recheck for a gap. And checking with the feelers again, I can see the rule is touching in the front and the back, or rather it's within 1.5 thousandths of an inch from front to back, which is my thinnest feeler gauge. With fence alignment, it's better to have a slight gap at the back. That way you can be sure the fence isn't angled toward the back of the blade. If it is, you can cause stock to bind as it's being cut. This could result in burning or worse, kickback. Now feeler gauges are really inexpensive. I think I paid about $5 for this one, and you can pick them up pretty much anywhere. The home centers have them, auto parts stores will have them. You can even get them online too. Now what if you don't have feeler gauges, you don't want to buy them, or it's the middle of the night and you want to get this done now? So if you look around your home for maybe some different thickness pieces of paper, for instance receipt paper is really thin, and then you can also use copy paper, which is a lot thicker than receipt paper, tissue paper, things like that, just varying thicknesses so you can get a gauge on how far away the saw blade is from the blade of your combination square. So as you can see, you can get a really great result using pretty much just a combination square and a set of feeler gauges. Now like I said, this is not the only way to do this. There's like everything else in life, there's plenty of different ways to do this. Another really common way to do this is with a dial indicator. Now, there's different variations on this obviously too, but the whole idea with this one is that you make a jig, or you buy a jig that includes the dial in it that rides in the miter slot, and then you can reference the dial indicator against the fence and the saw blade. Now, dial indicators are going to be a little more expensive, obviously, although I think this one here was about 30 bucks, but then you got to build a little jig for it. So that's another good solution. So I hope you found this useful, and I hope it kind of made this process a little less intimidating. I know when I first thought about doing this, it seemed like it was going to be pretty challenging, but it's really not that bad. It doesn't take a whole lot of time either. Now, the hardest thing about this is kind of figuring out how hard to hit the table with the mallet to make it move. And in my case, pretty hard. So thanks as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I talked about today or anything here in my shop, please leave me a comment. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.